I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, high-stakes meeting. President Joe Biden hosts the UK Prime Minister amid an increase in tension between Ukraine and Russia. Stamp of disapproval. Some lawmakers are raising concerns over mail-in ballots for the November elections. We're on Capitol Hill. The Pope and the press. The Holy Father wraps up his 12-day trip and holds his first news conference in around a year. We have analysis from Frank Roca and Ready to Walk. A report from the International Eucharistic Congress in Ecuador with a preview of tomorrow's massive procession. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us on the Feast of St. John Chrysostom. Our top story tonight, President Joe Biden meets with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the White House. Among the items on the agenda, the war in Ukraine and Ukraine's push to ease restrictions on the use of Western-supplied long-range weapons to target sites further inside of Russia. The Kremlin is responding. Earlier today, it expelled 6 British diplomats it accused of being spies and foreign agents. Britain denies the claims. President Vladimir Putin also says the use of long-range weapons at targets inside Russia would constitute a war between Moscow and NATO. Amid the heightened tensions, Russia today released 49 prisoners, mostly military members, back to Ukraine. It was the 56th prisoner exchange since the war began in February of 2022. And for analysis, we turn now to Joshua Huminski, Senior Vice President for National Security and Intelligence Programs at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Joshua, great to have you on the show today. We appreciate it. So what are you expecting from the meeting between President Biden and the Prime Minister of Britain?
The way that it's looking right now is that there's going to be a push, certainly from Prime Minister Starmer, to get President Biden to allow those long-range strikes with Western-supplied weapons well beyond what has been approved thus far. There's been short-range strikes within the occupied territories that Russia has taken and just across the border in self-defense positions, but there has not been anything deep inside Russia yet, and that is something that Ukraine is asking for. And President Biden is being asked by Prime Minister Starmer to hopefully loosen those restrictions and get unity amongst the allies.
Yeah, and Joshua, as we mentioned earlier, Russia just expelled 6 British diplomats, and President Vladimir Putin says permitting the use of long-range missiles further into Russia would constitute a war between Moscow and NATO. How seriously should we take these claims?
Well, first off, the expelled diplomats actually had their credentials revoked about a month ago. So this is just acting on something that Russia had already done first and foremost. I think the key thing to remember is that President Putin is really also speaking to a domestic audience. We're in a situation of a lot of creative fictions. Russia knows that the United States, the United Kingdom, is supplying weapons to Ukraine to defend itself and retake the occupied territories. So there's no real difference between an NLAW and a Javelin, which are anti-tank missiles, in practice in terms of definition, versus an ATACMS or a Storm Shadow long-range cruise missile. They're both Western-supplied weapons, and Russia knows this. So when President Putin comes out and says that this is potentially an act of war that is as much directed at an internal audience as it is an external audience. And by saying that to an external audience, certainly the West and being the United States, the United Kingdom, he's hoping to act as a self-deterrent aspect, if you will. So raising the prospect of war and increase in hostilities and escalation, which the West has been very concerned about and working to avoid. If he can introduce those doubts, then perhaps coming out of this meeting, President Biden may not agree to what Sir Keir is asking for and may not approve those long-range weapon strikes.
Before I let you go, how do you see this playing out, and are you at all concerned?
I think we need to be real cognizant of the fact that just because escalation has not happened yet doesn't mean that it won't. Just because Putin says he's doing something and then does not follow up on that doesn't mean that he won't in the future. So there's always going to be this calculated risk of what happens and how we push and pull and where the reactions are going to be. I think for me, the bigger issue is that when we talk about weapons platforms and strike distances, we're missing the point of what are those weapons meant for. And that's the key question that has not been answered. And what is the objective of the military actions for Ukraine? Is it retaking all of its territory, going back to the 2022 borders, to 1991, or setting up conditions for a negotiated settlement at some point in the future? The fixation on tactical weapons and operational weapons really distracts from that strategic and political question, which is ultimately what is going to resolve this conflict.
Well, Joshua, thank you for your time and for your insights today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Pope Francis is weighing in on the U.S. presidential election, strongly criticizing both candidates for what he called their anti-life policies. He made the comments on the papal flight back to Rome after concluding a four-nation tour through Asia. And joining us now from Rome to tell us more about the press conference is Frank Roca, senior Vatican analyst at EWTN News. Frank, great to be with you. So what did the Pope have to say about the upcoming U.S. presidential election?
Well, the Pope was asked how he would advise Catholic voters in the United States in choosing between the two major presidential candidates based on two major issues. He was asked how a Catholic should choose between a candidate, quote, who's in favor of abortion and another who wants to deport millions of migrants. And the Pope said that both positions were gravely wrong. He said both are anti-life, both the one who throws out migrants and the one who kills babies, both of them are against life. So he said people have to choose the lesser evil. But he wouldn't say what that lesser evil was. He said that everybody has to use his or her own conscience in deciding. So that position underscores a long-standing point of tension between the Vatican under Pope Francis and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, who have repeatedly said in their voter guide that opposition to abortion is the preeminent priority. But the Pope is saying, in effect, that abortion doesn't necessarily trump other issues.
Well, Frank, we also understand that the Holy Father spoke about the Vatican's relationship with China. What more can you tell us about that?
The Pope was very upbeat about the relationship with China. He said he's happy with the dialogue. He said the results are good. He even specifically praised the agreement that the Vatican signed with China in 2018 on the appointment of bishops, sharing power on the appointment of bishops there. The Pope was striking a much brighter note than some of his advisors who have expressed frustration with this arrangement. There are still 40 dioceses in China, more or less, that don't have bishops, and the Chinese have been slow in agreeing, they've said. But the Pope is striking an upbeat note, and he also said he still wants to go to China. He said this in the past, and he said it again.
And Frank, before I let you go, what were some of the other notable comments that the Holy Father mentioned to journalists on the plane?
Well, the Pope was asked about clerical sex abuse in a couple countries, in East Timor, which he had just visited, and in France. And he echoed some of the strong language he's used in the past in condemning clerical sex abuse. He said that it's demonic, that it destroys the dignity of the person. He also repeated something he said a number of times, which is he stressed that a lot of abuse occurs in the home and in the neighborhood, a comment that reflects his view that he's also expressed in the past, that the Church is perhaps sometimes unfairly singled out for scrutiny on the sex abuse question.
Oh, Frank, thank you so much for your reporting today. We really appreciate it. God bless.
Thank you.
Well, the White House was quick to respond to the Holy Father. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said, quote, obviously the Pope speaks for himself, and I don't have any more comments from here. Amid the Holy Father's comments, the presidential campaigns are in full swing. Former President Donald Trump heads out west while his opponent for the Oval Office, Vice President Kamala Harris, arrives in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. And each campaign is using new videos to appeal to voters. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports.
Tracy, Trump holds a rally in Las Vegas later tonight, and Harris, meanwhile, visiting Johnstown and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania for campaign events there tonight. And coming off that debate, the intense race to the finish line in November is officially in high gear. At his Los Angeles area golf club, and before heading to Northern California for a fundraiser, former President Donald Trump tells reporters,
we cannot allow Comrade Kamala Harris and the communist left to do to America what they did to California. The state of California is a mess with people leaving.
And today, he blasted Vice President Kamala Harris over the southern border, saying all states are really border states right now, calling himself the border president.
We went from a terrible border to a great border very quickly. I did a great job.
Meanwhile, as Vice President Harris flew off to Pennsylvania, trying to capitalize on her momentum after Tuesday night's contentious debate, the Vice President also released a new campaign ad using her comments from the event in Philadelphia.
I intend to be a president for all Americans and focus on investing right now in you, the American people. and we can chart a new way forward.
Trump also released a new campaign ad which says Harris copy and pasted Biden's failed economic agenda.
Bidenomics is working.
Bidenomics is working.
We have the strongest economy in the world.
Our economy is the strongest in the world.
My Build Back Better framework.
Our Build Back Better framework.
To a steady and stable growth.
Stable and steady growth.
And today at the White House, President Joe Biden holds a brunch on the South Lawn, celebrating black excellence.
I made a commitment. My administration would look like America, and it does.
Also tonight, 53 days until November 5th, and a new AP NORC poll revealing about half of Americans say they are following political news extremely or very closely, and about 6 in 10 say they need to limit how much information they consume about the government and politics to avoid feeling overloaded and fatigued. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
And states across the country, mail-in balloting for the November election has begun, but some election officials are warning that problems with the U.S. mail system could disrupt voting and even disenfranchise voters, and some lawmakers are expressing concerns. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales joins us with that story. Eric.
Good evening, Tracy. Yes, the U.S. Postal Service could play a role in this presidential election, and it's not the kind that it wants. Millions of voters are expected to cast their ballots by mail in the coming weeks, but officials from several states recently sent a letter to the Postmaster General warning that major problems haven't been fixed. The letter reads in part, quote, "We implore you to take immediate and tangible corrective action to address the ongoing performance issues with USPS election mail service. Failure to do so will risk limiting voter participation and trust in the election process. In recent primary voting, state officials noted cases of thousands of properly postmarked ballots that did not arrive in time to be counted. Wyoming Senator Cynthia Lummis tells me she's even tracked some of her own regular first-class mail, and it took 2 weeks to deliver.
It went from Cheyenne to Denver, then to Salt Lake City. And in Salt Lake City, it sat in a bin until enough mail was accumulated to deliver it to Star Valley, Wyoming.
In the 2020 presidential election during COVID, the Postal Service says about 43% of voters use mail-in balloting. Quote, "We were successful in 2020 delivering an historic volume of mail-in ballots, also in 2022, and will do so again in November 2024.
I think that the Postal Service actually performed pretty well in 2020 in terms of getting the ballots in on time. Most states require mail-in ballots to be sent within a sufficient period of time that they will arrive.
I think we need to be making mail-in voting easier and more accessible to everyday people to increase voter participation.
But Kansas Secretary of State Scott Schwab, who signed the letter, says the state had trouble with primary mail-in balloting and is advising voters against using it. He posted, quote, "The Pony Express is more efficient at this point."
Those kinds of hang-ups, if they're happening in Wyoming, they're happening elsewhere. And if they're happening with first-class mail, they will happen with mail-in ballots. And so the concerns are legitimate.
Now, postal officials do tell me that they expect less mail-in balloting this cycle, but they still urge people to send in their ballots as soon as possible to avoid any potential problems. But state officials warn even if those addresses are correct, it may not arrive on time. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
And we've a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including a serious crime. President Biden marks the 30th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act, how Catholic groups are addressing the issue.
It's shameful but true that our legal system condoned violence against women for hundreds of years. And even now, for example, right here in Washington, D.C., an abusive spouse is arrested in less than 15% of the cases where his victim is bleeding from an open wound. We cannot afford to wait any longer to treat domestic violence as something other than what it is, a serious crime.
That was then Senator Joe Biden talking about the Violence Against Women Act. He helped to write the legislation and introduced it in 1990. It eventually passed 4 years later. The landmark law is aimed at protecting and supporting survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. The president marked the 30th anniversary yesterday at the White House. To coincide with the event, he announced new measures to combat gender-based violence.
We're also issuing new policies to expand housing protections for survivors, give law enforcement more tools to remove guns from domestic abusers, and we're tackling the next frontier of gender-based violence and abuse, deep fake images and videos generated by artificial intelligence.
In a 2002 statement, the Catholic bishops of the United States affirmed their stance against domestic violence, stating, "We state as clearly and strongly as we can that violence against women inside or outside the home is never justified. Violence in any form, physical, sexual, psychological, or verbal, is sin. Often, it is a crime as well." And joining us now is Dr. Lori Prisby with Catholics for Family Peace, an organization that the USCCB cites as a resource on its website. Dr. Lori, great to be with you today. So tell us more about the Domestic Violence Against Women Act and the significance of it.
The government made a great statement to help protect women from domestic violence, from intimate partner violence. And the Catholics in our task force group with the USCCB decided that we would make a project, an initiative that would address this to help Catholics respond more effectively to their friends and their family members who turn to them, who, if they have been abused in their marriages or by their boyfriends. So we created a project about the same time as the Violence Against Women Act was passed, called Catholics for Family Peace. And it's our goal to educate people about what the church really does teach about domestic violence, that it's not acceptable in marriage, that marriage is not about submitting to abuse, but it is about a mutual partnership between a man and a woman, of people of equal dignity. So we have spent the last 12 years trying to educate people, and we have really received a great response from dioceses and parishes and organizations, women's groups. So we want to underscore what our government is doing to protect women by helping people to understand that the church stands with them too, and the church cares about them.
Yeah, and domestic violence is really a sensitive subject to talk about in general, but it can be especially hard for Catholics who find themselves in this type of situation. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how your organization is helping those in this situation, and also how you're working with clergy?
In the last 12 years, we've seen a lot more openness to talking about the subject because it's more in the news now, so that the people need to know that the church teaches that marriage is not something that makes women vulnerable to abuse, but it's supposed to be a partnership of equal dignity. So we want people to understand that they can give that message of hope to their friends or for themselves. A lot of times people think that domestic violence has to leave bruises, but there are hidden, silent kinds of violence and abuse that people experience in a relationship, both men and women, really. So that abuse could be emotional abuse, it could be sexual abuse or psychological abuse. And sometimes people use religion as a way to trap people into a domestic violence situation, saying, well, you have to forgive me or you have to obey me. And that's not what the church teaches. We have had a very good response from priests and deacons when they ask us to give them the words to say, to help them to talk to women who turn to them, and men do too, and to refer them to a local community situation that could help them get to safety.
Yeah, and it's so important to talk about this and, you know, try to get rid of the stigma. Dr. Lurie, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this very important subject. We really appreciate it. God bless you.
Thanks so much.
Up next on EWTN News Nightly, the Eucharist and Ecuador, a review of the 5th day of the global gathering in Quito. Welcome back. A church leader from Australia was among the speakers on Day 5 of the International Eucharistic Congress in Quito. Today's theme was Eucharist, Psalm of Fraternity. And for more on this, Father Thomas Petrie, president of the Dominican House of Studies and one of the co-hosts of EWTN's coverage, joins us right now. Father Petrie, great to be with you, and incredible work out there this week. Tell us more about the theme of the day and the remarks from Archbishop Fisher from Australia.
Well, as you know, every day during this International Eucharistic Congress has a theme, and today's theme, the last full day of the Eucharistic Congress, is the Eucharist, a psalm of fraternity, which is an interesting concept to think of the Eucharist as a psalm. We know of the book of Psalms, which are all of these prayers and songs that God himself inspired. And so we heard a talk today that this Eucharist is in some ways the praise of God, because Christ is the one who praises God in his sacrifice and resurrection. And in doing so, he makes us brothers and sisters, our fraternity. So the Eucharist is, the church's life is meant to be a sort of festive song. Even as we endure polarization or challenges or suffering, the Eucharist is always the one psalm, the song, if you will, that brings us back together with Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and we know the International Eucharistic Congress closes this weekend with a massive procession through the streets of Quito. Can you give us a preview of what's coming this weekend?
Well, it's going to be amazing. You know, there's been about regularly close to 16,000 attendees in this conference hall for this Congress. We expect there'll probably be more for the Eucharistic procession, which will be tomorrow evening through the city of Quito. It will be making stops at several historic churches, including the cathedral. It's going to be a beautiful thing. This is always one of the highlights. I think everyone remembers the very beautiful Eucharistic procession in Budapest at the last International Eucharistic Congress, and the procession in Indianapolis for the National Eucharistic Congress. It's a very public demonstration of our faith. And then, of course, Sunday we will have the closing Mass presided over by Cardinal Balthazar Porres, who is the papal delegate to this Eucharistic Congress.
Before I let you go, what have been some of the highlights for you, and what do you hope comes from this?
Well, these Eucharistic Congresses are always intended, even for those of us who live very regularly and daily in contact and in worship of the Eucharist, they're really meant to demonstrate the universality of the Church and to give sort of consolation and excitement for what God has done in the world, in the Church, and especially in the Blessed Sacrament. So I certainly have felt the complete warmth and consolation of the Spirit at work here in the Congress, in the Ecuadorian people. I know we have people from over 40 countries. I really expect and hope that this Congress will help ignite a greater devotion to the Eucharist in all the homes of all of the people who have attended here when they return Sunday to their places of where they live.
Well, Father Petrie, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for all of your incredible work. We really appreciate it. God bless you.
God bless you, Tracy. Thank you so much.
Well, finally tonight, as we mentioned, the Holy Father is back in Rome, and his trip spanned 12 days in 4 countries in Asia and Oceania. Catholic news agency Rome correspondent Courtney Morez shares some of the highlights.
It is the final day of Pope Francis's apostolic journey to Southeast Asia and Oceania. This 12-day journey to 4 countries has been the longest and no doubt the most arduous of Pope Francis's pontificate. For the first leg of the journey, Pope Francis visited the Indonesian capital of Jakarta. During his visit, the Pope participated in an interfaith meeting on the grounds of the largest mosque in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is the country with the largest Muslim population in the world. While Catholics only make up 3% of the population, there's still more than 8 million Catholics in Indonesia. The Holy Father also visited the Tunnel of Friendship, which connects the Istiklal Mosque and the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Assumption and symbolizes religious harmony. The Pope then flew to Papua New Guinea, a country renowned for its cultural, linguistic, and biodiversity, in which more than 800 languages are spoken. There was an incredible meeting of some of the country's 300 indigenous tribes who came together to welcome the Pope in the capital city of Port Moresby. Amid all of this diversity, Papua New Guinea is also an overwhelmingly Christian country, thanks to the work of many missionaries who first arrived in the 19th century and ventured deep into unexplored rainforests to evangelize the country. Pope Francis also traveled to the remote jungle outpost of Vanimo, where no pope has ever been before, to visit missionaries from Argentina and religious sisters who have been evangelizing the area for decades. For the next stop, Pope Francis flew to East Timor, which is not only one of the most Catholic countries in the world, but also one of the youngest. Close to 70% of its population is estimated to be under the age of 30. Besides visiting a school for children with disabilities, the Holy Father also visited Timorese youth at a Congress center and thanked them for their enthusiasm in living the faith. The highlight of this visit, however, was the closing Mass in the Tasi Tulu field, in which 600,000 people, nearly half of the country's population, attended. And finally, Pope Francis visited Singapore, a multicultural city-state and an Asian financial hub. Pope Francis praised Singapore's entrepreneurial spirit and efficient healthcare system, but the Pope also underlined the importance of protecting the dignity of the poor and the many migrant workers who support the economy. There is no doubt that this trip will be one of the most memorable of Francis's pontificate. In these past 2 weeks, Pope Francis has truly lived up to his nickname, a Pope of the Peripheries. In Singapore, Courtney Mares, EWTN News.
And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, X, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night, and God bless.